The number in my savings account is more than my mum made in a year when we first came here. I know that. And I still check it at 11 p.m. with this low-grade dread in my stomach, like something is about to go wrong. I was 26 when I finally had a real emergency fund. 6 months of expenses, sitting in a high-yield savings account, exactly like every personal finance article told me to do. I remember the day it hit that number. I was at my desk eating leftover congee my mum had dropped off, and I refreshed the page, and there it was. I waited to feel something. Relief, maybe. Pride. The feeling you're supposed to have when you've done the thing right. It didn't come. What came instead was, is this enough though? What if I lose my job? What if something happens to my parents? What if the rent goes up again? I closed the app and went back to work and didn't think about it for the rest of the day, which is its own kind of answer. Here's what I understand now that I didn't then. That feeling, the one that doesn't move even when the number does, has a name. It's called a scarcity mindset, and it's not a personality flaw. It's a nervous system response. When your brain has spent years operating in an environment where money was genuinely precarious, it doesn't just switch off when the precarity ends. It stays in threat detection mode. It keeps scanning. It's doing its job. The problem is that it can't tell the difference between then and now. My parents came here in the early 90s with essentially nothing. I mean that literally. My dad once told me they had less than $200 between them when they landed at SFO. My mum's first job was at a restaurant in the Richmond district, the kind with roast ducks hanging in the window on hooks, and she worked doubles on weekends and sent whatever she could back to her mother in Fujian. There was no buffer. There was no plan B. Every month was a math problem with no margin for error. She used to say, still says, te ting ko ting, which translates roughly to, when your hand stops, your mouth stops. When you stop working, you stop eating. It's not a philosophy she chose. It's just what was true for a very long time, and I absorbed it. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it, but because kids absorb the emotional texture of a household. I grew up watching my mum check prices on everything twice. I grew up knowing we didn't talk about money to outsiders, that what we had or didn't have was private in a way that felt almost physical, like a door you kept shut. I grew up with the understanding, never stated, just present in the air. That security was something other people had, and we were always one bad month from the edge. That understanding didn't leave when I graduated. It didn't leave when I got a salary with benefits and started contributing to my 401k almost by accident because HR enrollment was automatic. It moved in with me. It sits next to me when I open my banking app at night. The thing is, scarcity mindset isn't irrational for people who've actually experienced scarcity. For my mum, hypervigilance around money kept her family fed. The pattern made sense. What's hard, what I'm still working through, is that I inherited the alarm system without inheriting the conditions that required it. I have the reflex without the reason, and a reflex that fires constantly, even in safety, is exhausting. For a long time, I dealt with this by just ignoring my money, which sounds counterintuitive, but it made a strange kind of sense. If checking my account made me anxious, I'd check it less. If thinking about retirement felt overwhelming, I'd think about it some other time. My 401k contributions were going in, technically, because they were automatic. But I'd never once looked at what they were invested in. I'd never increased my contribution percentage beyond the default. I didn't have a Roth IRA because opening one felt like a decision I wasn't qualified to make, and the discomfort of that was easier to avoid than to sit with. This is what behavioral economists call avoidance, and it's incredibly common in people who grew up with financial anxiety. The emotional cost of engaging with money feels higher than the cost of ignoring it, so you ignore it. And the avoidance itself becomes a money script, a story you're living by without realizing it. Mine was, this stuff isn't for people like me to figure out, which was my mother's story repackaged. She didn't trust banks for years after coming here. Why would she? The institutions she'd encountered in China were not safe places to put your trust. So she kept cash, diversified it across different spots in the apartment, and watched it carefully herself. That was her version of control. I turned it into paralysis. The shift, and I'm going to be honest with you, it wasn't a single moment. It was more like a slow leaning into. Started when I actually opened my 401k account and looked at it. Really looked. I was invested in the default target date fund, which is fine, actually fine, but I had no idea what was in it or why. So I spent one Saturday morning, not a whole day, just a morning, with tea at my kitchen table, reading about what a target date fund actually is. Then I looked at whether my employer matched contributions above the default 3%. They matched up to 6%. I had been leaving money on the table for 2 years. I changed my contribution to 6% that same morning. I want to be clear that I sat there for a while before I hit confirm. My brain was doing its thing. What if you need this money? What if something happens? You're going to have less in your paycheck. And I had to consciously hold the thought. This is the alarm system. This is not a real threat. I hit confirm. Then, a few months later, I opened a Roth IRA. I went with Fidelity because a friend had recommended it, and the interface didn't make me want to close the tab immediately, which is genuinely a factor when you're already fighting avoidance. I set up a recurring contribution of $200 a month. Not because I'd done a perfectly optimized calculation, but because it was a number I could start with and not immediately panic about. I invested it in a simple index fund. I did not overthink it. I still check my savings account at night sometimes. I'm not going to pretend that changed. But there's something slightly different in how I do it now. I'm less looking for evidence of disaster and more just checking. The way you'd check a door is locked, not the way you'd check because you already hear footsteps. My mum still can't fully understand why I put money into accounts I can't touch until I'm 59 and a half. She's asked me about it. I've tried to explain it and usually end up somewhere in the middle. She doesn't quite trust it. I don't quite know how to translate the whole concept of compound growth into something that maps onto her experience of money. But she also saw me buy my own couch last year and not borrow money to do it, and something passed over her face that I think was relief. We don't really talk about it directly. We're working on that. The scarcity mindset she passed to me wasn't a mistake. It was what kept her going. What I'm trying to do, slowly, imperfectly, sometimes while eating leftover congee and refreshing a bank app, is take the care she taught me and point it somewhere it can actually grow. If this hit close to home, you're not alone, and you're not stuck repeating it. Subscribe for more stories about money, family, and the quiet patterns that shape how we live. See you in the next one.